What's up, what's up? This is Cash, aka the Blackgarou, and I am the Hero Hunter.
Only legends.
Alright, clearly I'm surrounded by false heroes, but it's all good because I'm here with Black History Haymakers. Who's first?
No, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, are we going to take down statues to George Washington?
Nah, we're not here to take down statues. We're here to take down fake heroes.
Why did George Washington have slaves if he was against slavery?
Excellent question, young lady. The question really is, how does someone reconcile having enslaved peoples under their command by pain of death while still telling people that they're against it at the same time? You are that young and can clearly see a blatant hypocrisy.
So it can seem like a contradiction that somebody like Washington, who was opposed to slavery, could actually be a slave owner himself. And that was a contradiction that Washington recognized during his lifetime. He was quite aware that there was some hypocrisy involved in that.
Hypocrisy involved? You mean he was a hypocrite? How was he opposed to slavery if it's something he did till the day he died? That is the least opposed to something you can ever be.
And there are a few reasons why Washington remained a slave owner throughout his life. Washington didn't become opposed to slavery until later on, after the Revolutionary War. Before that point, he had purchased a large number of enslaved people to grow his plantation.
A large number? She means over 300 by the time he died, including a 3-year-old girl that he sold.
And by the 1780s, as he's growing opposed to slavery and really seeing the evils of the institution, he, at that point, owns several hundred enslaved people.
Seeing the evils of the institution? He didn't just witness the evils, he was the evil. He was one of the biggest ones, and literally the start of a country that perpetuated it.
So the question becomes, what is he going to do with those people? What is the solution that is going to get him out of this institution? And he had two choices, essentially. He could sell them or he could free them. At that point, he was opposed for moral reasons to selling enslaved people. So he turned towards looking to emancipate them. Some of the barriers that Washington encountered as he looked into freeing his slaves were financial. As a plantation, Mount Vernon operated with enslaved labor, and that was the really fundamental system for the economy in this entire region.
Got you. It operated with enslaved labor, meaning he made all his profits and paid his workers nothing by pain of whip, also rape and so on and so forth. That it was a fundamental system for the economy. What you mean to say is that America, since its inception, since its first founding father and president, has been built off of slave labor.
And Washington knew that if he were to free his slaves, he would have to find another way to operate his plantation and another way to provide income for himself and for his family. And that might have necessitated really changing the way that he lived and potentially sacrificing a lifestyle that he had become accustomed to.
Sacrificing a lifestyle he'd become accustomed to. You got to lay that out for the children, though.
What were George Washington's teeth made of?
What were Washington's teeth made out of? Well, everybody knows that Washington had wooden teeth, except he didn't. We have one full set that survives here in the collection at Mount Vernon, and it is made from a combination of animal teeth and human teeth and some elephant ivory that has been carved into the shape of one tooth. The animal teeth are coming from probably cows and horses and have been sort of filed down to the proper shape for a human mouth.
You're talking about him taking the teeth out of healthy people without anesthetic to try to implant them into his own face. We need to stop lying about this wooden teeth-ish. All right? You need to talk about sacrificing his lifestyle of being able to kick his feet up on a black person's back when he needs to rest his feet. Or selling, like I said earlier, 3-year-old children to other people. You said he was against selling his enslaved folks to free them? Selling them would have just been pushing it down the line. That's not taking responsibility. Emancipation is taking responsibility. He was being evil. That is the lifestyle he did not want to sacrifice. The same way people argue sometimes today about white privilege.
Were my children free with me as well? Let us suppose that they were. I have not given very much thought to it, as most times I imagine my life would end with me being in bondage. The first thing that I might do if I were free would be able to go up to Alexandria throughout the week and not just at slave market on Sundays.
As he's considering freeing his slaves, doesn't seem to be willing to make a huge financial sacrifice.
Yeah, because the niggas is taking their plates away.
Washington, while he was quite wealthy in terms of land and other property, he actually didn't have a lot of cash. And so he would have had to come up with some way to get the money to finance an emancipation.
He actually didn't have a lot of cash? I gotta stop you right there. 67 years he did no work and made all the profit. Plus he was in the military. What? How can somebody... So you're telling me George Washington was broke? All that over 300 people owned to be broke? I don't get it.
And he did look into several ways of doing that by either renting or selling some of his land, but he wasn't able to find a solution that he really found acceptable. That he actually didn't own about half of the enslaved people who were here at Mount Vernon. They were actually owned by the estate of Martha Washington's first husband.
Just come out the front and say it. White women had a role in enslavement. Many of them came with enslaved peoples as a part of their dowry. Many of them, as white women, outlived their white husbands who died from disease early on. So they would live a healthy lifestyle just with a few enslaved peoples. They wrote a lot of laws on how to punish enslaved peoples. Y'all got to read the book, They Were Her Property. We've now understood as reparationists and Black Americans that it wasn't necessarily just a patriarchy that was oppressing us, but a heterarchy, because white women benefited from this racist structure in America, straight up.
And so when Washington is considering freeing his slaves, he knows that he doesn't have the legal authority to free the dower slaves. And he knew that separating families was one of the worst evils of slavery. And he's very concerned about the fact that those families would be separated if he chose to emancipate his own slaves. Ultimately, Washington chose to free his slaves in his will, where he put a provision that would emancipate them at Martha's death.
Martha Washington owning half of the slaves during the time that George Washington, who was the first president, just shows the access to wealth that white women had back then. And right now, the argument is that George Washington couldn't free his slaves because it was going to break up the families. Are y'all bullshitting me right now? Y'all already done broke up the families and the entire dynasties, the last names, the culture and all that. Now you're worried about that? George Washington sold a 3-year-old. He don't give a damn about keeping families together. This is a false argument. She's trying to make it seem like George Washington was so benevolent. He didn't want to free his slaves because it was going to break up the enslaved families. That is bullshit. Matter of fact, freeing half of them would have helped half them out overnight from being raped. They could have saved money and bought their own family members and freed them themselves.
And waiting until after both he and his wife died solved his financial issue, because it meant that his estate could provide for the freed slaves. It didn't solve the issue of family separation, however, as the dower slaves remained in bondage after Martha died, even as their Washington family members went free.
Pause. So she's saying that they still separated the families, even though that was his intention, was to keep them together, so quote unquote. His intention was to keep the families that were created from him having enslaved folks, over 150, and her marrying him with slaves from a previous marriage of over 150. These two commingled and created brand new families on the Washington estate. And George Washington said he didn't want to free his half of the slaves because it was going to break up the families. But now she's telling us that they still broke up the families even after Martha's death because she retained ownership of her half. She didn't care what George Washington fought for, what he argued, that he was against slavery and wanted to free his peoples, because she wasn't freeing shit. So they still broke up the families.
So as you can see, Washington really grappled with a lot of issues as he was growing more opposed to slavery over the course of his life. And he did make efforts to remove himself from the institution of slavery, and he considered freeing his slaves before he died, but he wasn't able to come up with a solution that he was happy with until after his death.
Ultimately, George Washington was so against slavery, so ready to free his slaves, that he said, y'all niggas is free after my wife dies. Does that make any sense to anybody? How can you be against slavery so much that you start a whole country based on it, that your entire lifestyle is based on it, that you don't free them until after you die, and not even after you die, but after someone else dies? They got to stay working until after she's gone? That's crazy, man. Damn George Washington. So in conclusion, we don't want no statues taken down. We want lies to stop being told. Why were we taught about this man? I understand that America's a country, but we need to tell the truth and hold our heroes up in serious regard. And this is not a hero. This is a zero.
How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? I do love him. Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue.
Donald Trump, just know I got hands for you too. But today, you know what? It's not about you. Thomas Jefferson's another one. I'm going to run through him quick, man. I don't got time for all this. He had over 600 slaves, known to have raped those slaves. He had at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, which some people try to dispute that it was his brother or his cousin or some shit. They were raping people legally on the plantation and in this country, especially the founding fathers. All right. George Washington already mentioned. Now we got Thomas Jefferson. Take the statues down, take the lies down, tell the truth in the schools. That's it. And Thomas Jefferson, with that Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He did not mean all human beings. People need to stop drinking the Kool-Aid. He was only talking about white men who were educated and owned land. Stolen land, tell you the truth. But he was trying to say he was so revolutionary because he believed every man could be king, instead of just the king being king. But they wanted to be kings over their own land that was stolen, as I said before, with people working as subjects under them under fear of the lash. That is no future I want to live in, and that is no founding father of mine. Down with Thomas Jefferson.